Hello everyone, I am Noor Zainab and welcome to my YouTube channel. In today's video, I'm going to discuss about the transport of gases in the blood. I will also discuss about the hamburger phenomenon, which is also known as chloride shift. Our respiratory system helps us to breathe in oxygen by means of inhalation, and we breathe out carbon dioxide by means of exhalation. So have you ever wondered that the oxygen which we breathe in, how it is transported to our body organs or to individual cells of our organs, or the carbon dioxide which is produced in our tissues, how it is transported out of our body? The oxygen which comes from our lungs, which is inhaled from the outside air by our lungs, is transported by means of our red blood cells to all of our body organs. Whereas the carbon dioxide which is produced in the cells of our body organs is transported again through our blood cells to the outside air by means of our lungs. So in this way I can say that the transport of gases, the major gases which are transported in our blood are carbon dioxide and oxygen, and this transport of gases is carried out by means of our circulatory system. So in this way the circulatory system and the respiratory system are related very much. The respiratory gases are transported in various regions of our body by means of the blood. The blood transports this oxygen from the lungs to different tissues, and carbon dioxide is transported from the tissues of the body to the lungs. So here is a flowchart which will help us to discuss today's topic more easily. The transport of gases in blood. There are two main types of gases which are transported in our blood: oxygen and carbon dioxide. The transport of oxygen occurs from our lungs towards our tissues, and CO2 is transported from our tissues and it is exhaled by our lungs. Oxygen is transported in two major ways. It can be transported as dissolved in the blood plasma, and it can be transported as oxyhemoglobin. Whereas the transport of carbon dioxide occurs in our blood in three major ways. It can be transported as bicarbonate ions or carboxyhemoglobin, and carbon dioxide can also be transported in our blood as dissolved in the blood plasma. So let's start by the discussion of how oxygen is transported in our blood. 3% of the oxygen is transported as dissolved in the blood plasma, whereas 97% of the oxygen which is inhaled is transported in our blood as oxyhemoglobin. So now let's discuss that how oxygen is transported as oxyhemoglobin. Approximately 97% of the oxygen in our blood is carried by hemoglobin, which is a protein which is found in our red blood cells. The red blood cells are also known as erythrocytes. Erythrocytes do not contain nucleus and some other organelles, so they contain so much hemoglobin which helps the red blood cells to transport more oxygen. So let's start the transport of oxygen in the blood as oxyhemoglobin. What actually is oxyhemoglobin? First of all, we should know the structure of the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a respiratory pigment. Respiratory pigments are actually colored molecules, and they act as oxygen carriers by bonding reversibly with oxygen. Hemoglobin consists of 4 polypeptide chains. Out of the 4 polypeptide chains, 2 are beta chains and 2 are alpha chains. Each molecule of the hemoglobin contains 4 heme groups or iron-containing groups. Each is able to bind with one oxygen molecule. The word hemoglobin consists of two main parts: hemo and globin. The word hemo means iron, and this part of the hemoglobin carries oxygen, whereas the globin means protein, and the protein portion of the hemoglobin carries carbon dioxide. So in hemoglobin there are four protein chains which are known as two alpha chains and two beta chains, and there is a heme group or iron group in each polypeptide chain. Hemoglobin is composed of four polypeptide chains, which are the polymers of amino acids, each with an iron containing heme group that will bind reversibly with an oxygen molecule. Each molecule of the hemoglobin can carry four oxygen molecules, or 8 oxygen atoms in total. This is because each hemoglobin consists of 4 iron-containing heme groups, and each iron molecule can bind with one oxygen molecule. So how oxygen is transported as a hemoglobin? Whenever the oxygen binds with hemoglobin, a molecule known as oxyhemoglobin is formed, and this reaction is reversible. It means that oxyhemoglobin can be converted into oxygen and hemoglobin. We breathe in oxygen, and this oxygen is coming from our lungs. Inside our blood cells, inside our red blood cells, the oxygen will bind to hemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin is formed, and whenever it reaches our tissues or body cells, oxygen is released to our tissue cells. At high concentration of the oxygen, oxyhemoglobin is formed, whereas at low oxygen concentrations or low PO2, PO2 means partial pressure of oxygen, at low oxygen concentration, oxyhemoglobin is dissociated to form hemoglobin and oxygen, and the oxygen is released to our body cells. So in this way, the oxygen which we inhale by means of our lungs is transported by means of oxyhemoglobin in our blood. HB4, it is written HB4 because there are four polypeptide chains of the hemoglobin. Each polypeptide can be attached with four oxygen molecules. So whenever we inhale oxygen, four oxygen molecules attach with four heme groups to form oxyhemoglobin. At high partial pressure of oxygen, high PO2, which is in the lungs, oxyhemoglobin is formed, which is known as HB4, which is 4 hemoglobin peptides and 8 oxygen atoms. Whereas in low oxygen concentration, which is in our tissues, body tissues, oxyhemoglobin is broken down into hemoglobin and oxygen. At the high partial pressure of oxygen, oxygen will bind with hemoglobin. This binding is reversible and it occurs in the lungs in the presence of an enzyme known as carbonic anhydrase. Each molecule of the hemoglobin can bind with 4 molecules of oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin. The ability of the hemoglobin to bind with oxygen is known as oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. The binding of oxygen with the hemoglobin is reversible, and it occurs always in the presence of an enzyme which is known as carbonic anhydrase. And this enzyme is present in our red blood cells, and it helps the hemoglobin to bind with oxygen molecules so that they can be transported as oxyhemoglobin. Now that we have discussed the transport of oxygen as oxyhemoglobin, let's discuss that how oxygen is transported as dissolved in the blood plasma. So we know the composition of our blood. Our blood consists of three main parts. The first part is the blood plasma, which is the liquid portion of the blood. And then there are red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. So the main thing is that the red blood cells, we have discussed that how red blood cells help us to transport oxygen. Now we are going to discuss that how plasma helps us to transport the oxygen molecules. Only 3% of our oxygen which we inhale is transported as being dissolved in the oxygen in the blood plasma. Only 3% is transported like this. But the 97% of the oxygen is transported by binding with hemoglobin, which is present in our red blood cells. So till now about the transport of gases in our blood, we have discussed the oxygen transport, from how the oxygen is transported when we inhale from our lungs, and it is transported to all of our body tissues. It is transported as being dissolved in the blood plasma and as well as oxyhemoglobin. So now let's come to the part where carbon dioxide is transported from all of our body cells and tissues towards the lungs, where it is exhaled from our body during expiration. It is transported by three main ways: bicarbonate ions, carboxyhemoglobin, or carbon dioxide can also be transported as being dissolved in the blood plasma. About 70% of the carbon dioxide which we exhale is transported as bicarbonate ions. Only 23% is transported in our blood as carboxyhemoglobin, and 7% of the carbon dioxide is transported as being dissolved in the blood plasma. Blood plasma is the liquid portion of the blood. Approximately 70% of the carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate ions in our blood cells. The formula of bicarbonate ions is HCO3 minus ions. They are also known as HCO3 minus ions. So let's discuss this very interesting topic of how carbon dioxide is transported in our blood as bicarbonate ions. So let's suppose these are our tissue cells. Tissue cells make up tissues, and tissues make up organs, and organs make up organ systems. Our cells during cell metabolism produce carbon dioxide. So this carbon dioxide should be transported through our cells. It should be removed through our cells and it should be exhaled. So how this occurs, that how carbon dioxide is transported from our cells to the outside air? It occurs by means of blood. So let's suppose this is a capillary wall and it is a systemic capillary. Systemic capillary means it is a capillary that surrounds our body organs, like it can be liver or stomach or any body organ. So, and here comes our red blood cell. So how this carbon dioxide will be removed from our body cells? This carbon dioxide enters the capillary by diffusion, and when it enters the capillary by diffusion, it will start to enter into the red blood cells. When the carbon dioxide enters the red blood cell, here it will find some water molecules. But the carbon dioxide produced will react with water molecules only in the presence of an enzyme which is known as carbonic anhydrase. This enzyme is present in our red blood cells only. It is not present in the blood plasma, which is the liquid portion of the blood. So carbon dioxide can react with water molecules only inside the red blood cells. It cannot react with water molecules outside the red blood cell. It is that CO2 cannot react with water outside the red blood cells in the blood plasma. When carbon dioxide reacts with water in the red blood cell, inside the red blood cell, in the presence of an enzyme which is known as carbonic anhydrase, an acid which is known as carbonic acid is formed, which is known as H2CO3. Carbonic acid or H2CO3 is an unstable compound and it dissociates to form hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions, which are HCO3 minus ions. The HCO3 minus ions diffuse out into the plasma. The HCO3 minus ions or the bicarbonate ions will exit from the red blood cell. They will come out of the red blood cells into the blood plasma. To balance this, the chlorine ions will go inside the red blood cells. So here the two ions have done opposite movement. It is the HCO3 minus ions are coming outside of the red blood cells, whereas the chlorine ions are going inside the red blood cells. Yes. Okay. So this movement of the opposite ions going opposite direction is known as chloride shift or Hamburger phenomenon. This is achieved by a special bicarbonate chloride carrier proteins that exist in the red blood cell membrane. And this protein is a special protein and it functions in moving the two ions, it is the chloride ion and the bicarbonate ion, in opposite directions, and it maintains the balance of ions in either direction, and this is known as chloride shift. So this was the story of bicarbonate ions. So what happens with the H plus ions? As there are H plus ions, the presence of H plus ions will increase the pH or the acidity of the blood, and it will decrease the pH of the blood, or it will increase the acidity of the blood. It is the blood can be more acidic, so it leads to the decrease in pH. The H plus ions will be accumulated in our red blood cell and it will decrease the pH and our blood will become more acidic. So in order to maintain this thing, in order so that this does not occur, what happens is that there is hemoglobin in our red blood cells. The hemoglobin will buffer the hydrogen formed, that is, the hemoglobin will react with H plus ions to form a molecule known as hemoglobinic acid or HHB. So in this way, the H plus ions, the hydrogen ions in our red blood cell, react with the hemoglobin to form hemoglobinic acid, whereas the bicarbonate ions or HCO3 minus ions came outside of our red blood cells. Instead of this, the chloride ions will go to take the position of the bicarbonate ions, and this phenomenon was known as chloride shift or Hamburger phenomenon. Usually, the hemoglobin has 4 oxygen molecules attached with it. So when hydrogen ions react with hemoglobin, which is having 4 oxygen atoms, hemoglobinic acid is formed, but oxygen is also released. This oxygen is gone, it is transported to the tissue cells. In this way, our tissue cells will also accept the oxygen molecules. So in this way we have discussed that what is hemoglobinic acid. Hemoglobinic acid is always formed when hemoglobin reacts with hydrogen ion. So in short story we can say that how carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate ion. Whenever CO2 is produced, it enters the capillary. In the capillaries, it reacts with red blood. It goes into the red blood cells. Inside red blood cells, carbon dioxide meets with water molecules to form carbonic acid in the presence of an enzyme known as carbonic anhydrase. The carbonic acid is an unstable compound. It quickly dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ions react with hemoglobin to form hemoglobinic acid, whereas the bicarbonate ions quickly go out of the red blood cell in order to compensate this. The chloride ions will enter the red blood cell, and this phenomenon is known as chloride shift or Hamburger phenomenon. So this HCO3 minus ion which you are seeing is the bicarbonate ion, and this is how 70% of the carbon dioxide is transported in our blood. So now as we have discussed that the chloride ions will go inside the red blood cell, and while going inside the red blood cell they will combine with potassium ions which exist inside our red blood cells in order to form a salt which is known as potassium chloride. In this way KCl is produced inside our red blood cell, whereas the bicarbonate ions in the red blood cell which exited the red blood cell and went into the blood plasma will combine with sodium ions which exist in the blood plasma in order to form sodium bicarbonate. In this way we have known now that chloride ions will enter the red blood cell and there they combine with potassium to form KCl, whereas the bicarbonate ions that exited the red blood cell they combined with sodium ions which were outside the red blood cell to form sodium bicarbonate. And in this way we can say that the blood pH is maintained at 7.4, which is constant. pH is maintained by this buffer mechanism that exists always in the blood. So here till now we have discussed that how carbon dioxide is transported from our tissue cells into our blood. So now let's discuss that this carbon dioxide is transported in being as being bicarbonate ion in our blood, how it will be transported outside into the air as carbon dioxide. That how bicarbonate ion is transferred again into carbon dioxide in order to be exited by our lungs. So let's suppose this is an alveolus which is present inside our lungs. This is the gaseous exchange at the alveoli. It means that the capillary which you are going to see now is the pulmonary capillary. It is the capillary which is around the alveolus. Okay, so now here comes our red blood cell. What happens that we know hemoglobinic acid HHB, which was formed when hemoglobin was attached with hydrogen ions. This hemoglobin is present in the blood plasma. Also we have the bicarbonate ions which were being transported in the blood plasma. Now what happens is the hemoglobinic acid breaks down into hemoglobin ions and H plus ions. These two molecules are produced. The H plus ions are present in the red blood cell. What happens is the bicarbonate ions, which are HCO3 minus ions, start to enter the red blood cell. When this happens, when the HCO3 minus ions enter the red blood cell, they quickly combine with H plus ions in order to form an acid. But when HCO3 minus ions enter the red blood cell, we know that there is an ion which does opposite of it. It is that the chloride ions exit the red blood cell. So what happens is that the hemoglobinic acid is broken down and bicarbonate HCO3 minus ions are entering the red blood cell, whereas the chloride ions are exiting the red blood cell. What happens when bicarbonate ions enter the red blood cell? There they meet with H plus ions and they both H plus ions and HCO3 minus ions combine together in the presence of an enzyme carbonic anhydrase to form an acid which is known as carbonic acid H2CO3. This reaction occurs only in the red blood cells because only in the red blood cells carbonic anhydrase enzyme is present. It is not present in the blood plasma, so this reaction will not occur in the blood plasma. It will always occur in the red blood cells. What happens is that the H2CO3 compound or the carbonic acid is an unstable compound and it is quickly broken down into H2O, which is water, and carbon dioxide, which is CO2. This CO2 is transported out of the capillary by means of diffusion into the alveoli. There are many alveoli, so the carbon dioxide is transported there, and through the alveolar duct it is moved into the from the alveoli. The carbon dioxide is transported to the alveolar duct, and from there to the bronchioles and then bronchi, and then carbon dioxide travels to the trachea, and then it is exhaled through our mouth and nose. So here we have discussed how carbon dioxide is transported from our blood cells to the outside air which we exhale every time we exhale carbon dioxide, and how the bicarbonate ions are converted into carbon dioxide. The short story is that the bicarbonate ions enter the red blood cell. There they meet with H plus ions. Where the H plus ions comes from? They come from the hemoglobinic acid which breaks down into the H plus ions and hemoglobin. So bicarbonate ions will combine with H plus ions to form carbonic acid, which will again be broken down into water and carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide is released into the alveoli from where they are exited outside by means of expiration. So here is a quick summary of all the steps which are taken, that the tissue cells are producing carbon dioxide by means of cell metabolism, and this CO2 is entering the red blood cells of the systemic capillary. When the carbon dioxide enters the red blood cell, there is present water, H2O. CO2 quickly combines with H2O in the presence of an enzyme carbonic anhydrase to form H2CO3. H2CO3 is an unstable compound and it breaks down into bicarbonate ions and H plus ions. The H plus ions will combine with hemoglobin to form hemoglobinic acid, and the HCO3 ions are unstable. They will go outside of the red blood cell. When they go outside, the Cl minus ions, the chloride ions, will come inside. Okay, now the carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate ions. When this bicarbonate ions comes towards the pulmonary capillary, the bicarbonate ions will enter the red blood cells. This is the completely opposite of what we have discussed earlier. The bicarbonate ions will enter the red blood cell. There they will combine with hydrogen ions from the hemoglobinic acid. Because bicarbonate ions are entering, the chloride ions will exit. And when bicarbonate ions react with H plus ions, carbonic acid H2CO3 is formed, and this carbonic acid is very unstable and it breaks down into carbon dioxide and H2O. This carbon dioxide will exit the pulmonary capillary by means of diffusion and it is released to the alveolus from which it is breathed out. So now we have discussed that how carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate ions in our blood. So now let's discuss that how carbon dioxide is transported as being attached with hemoglobin, which is how carbon dioxide is transported as carboxyhemoglobin. So hemoglobin consists of 4 polypeptide chains as we have discussed. The hemoglobin molecule consists of 4 polypeptide chains. The polypeptide chains will help us to transport the carbon dioxide, whereas the heme groups, each polypeptide consists of one heme group. It means there are 4 heme groups. The heme groups help us to transport oxygen, whereas the polypeptide chains help us to transport carbon dioxide. And now how carbon dioxide is transported as being dissolved in the blood plasma. Only 7% of carbon dioxide is carried by being dissolved in blood plasma. This is an inefficient way to carry carbon dioxide, but it occurs in our body. And carbon dioxide is being dissolved in the plasma and it is carried by our blood and it is then exhaled through the air by means of our lungs. So here you can see the 3 main ways by which carbon dioxide is transported in our blood. The first part is how carbon dioxide is transported as being dissolved in blood plasma. The second arrow shows us how it is transported by being attached with hemoglobin to form carboxyhemoglobin. And the third arrow shows us that how carbon dioxide is transported as being formed bicarbonate ions, that CO2 will combine with water in the presence of an enzyme known as carbonic anhydrase, and then bicarbonate ions are formed. When bicarbonate ions are formed, they travel outside into the blood plasma. In order to compensate this, chloride ions enter the red blood cell and H plus ions will combine with hemoglobin to form hemoglobinic acid, and when hemoglobinic acid is formed, oxygen is released into the body tissues. And the exact opposite of this occurs at lungs. It is the alveoli, that the carbon dioxide is released into the alveoli, dissolved carbon dioxide is released, and the carboxyhemoglobin is broken down into hemoglobin, and hemoglobin remains in the red blood cell, whereas the carbon dioxide is released into the alveoli. And again, the bicarbonate ions enter the red blood cell, they form carbonic acid, and the carbon dioxide is released, whereas the water molecules remain in the red blood cell. And oxygen is taken from the alveoli, which we are breathing or inhaling, and it is reacted with hemoglobinic acid to form hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin, which is HbO2 is known as oxyhemoglobin, whereas HbCO2 is known as carboxyhemoglobin. So here you can see that how that 93% of the carbon dioxide from our body tissues, it is produced in our body tissues during metabolism, is diffused into the red blood cell. In the red blood cell, only 23% combines with hemoglobin to form carboxyhemoglobin, and 70% is transported by means of bicarbonate ions. Now, 7% of the carbon dioxide is transported as being dissolved in the blood plasma. So in this way, three ways are depicted. 7% carbon dioxide is dissolved in the plasma, 70% is converted into bicarbonate ions, and 23% of the carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin and is transported in our blood as carboxyhemoglobin. So here is the entire summary of what we have discussed in this video. We have discussed the transport of gases by means of blood, the transport of oxygen, the transport of CO2. Oxygen is transported by means of blood from our lungs towards our tissues. It is transported to all of our body tissues. It can be transported as being dissolved in blood plasma, or oxygen can attach with hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. Now we also discussed the transport of carbon dioxide from all of our body tissues, and it is transported by our blood to our lungs where it is exhaled outside into the air. It occurs in three main ways, as converting into bicarbonate ions as carboxyhemoglobin, or it can be transported, carbon dioxide can be transported as being dissolved in the liquid portion of the blood, which is blood plasma. So thanks for watching. Like, share and subscribe to my channel for more videos.